Up until now, we only wrote some code, but we didn't write any corresponding tests. And today's the day I want to change that because we want to make sure that our code is maintainable and it still runs the same in the future. And the biggest testing framework that's available in PHP is called PHPUnit. So let's go ahead and install and configure that. We can simply add it using Composer. So we do a Composer require PHPUnit/PHPUnit as a development dependency, and it's installed. Now our PHPUnit file lives in vendor bin PHPUnit. And you can see there's a bunch of configuration options here, but we can also use a configuration file. So let's generate it with generate configuration. And let's keep the defaults here for now. As you can see, we get a phpunit.xml file here, and we can add it to Git. And if you want to keep this as close as possible to professional environments, let's rename this to phpunit.xml.dist, because whenever PHPUnit runs, it will first check for a phpunit.xml file, and then we have a phpunit.xml.dist file. So if some colleague wants to run with a different configuration, they can. And let's in fact also add the phpunit.xml, the local file, to the git ignore. So whenever someone does use it, it doesn't get added to Git. And let's take a quick look at the configuration file we got. And let's make sure that this is a relative path. And new line. And it already configured one test suite for us. And we're going to start with unit. So let's rename this. It points to the unit folder. And there's usually 3 test suites. So there's one unit test suite, one integration, and one functional. But for now, we're going to start off with unit test. Let's also make sure that our folder exists. And we're ready to write our first test. Now is probably a good time to explain the difference between a unit, integration, or functional test. And let's start with the functional test, because it's the most complete test where we have a database and we have a browser where we act as the user. But the tests are quite slow because we have some network latency, even if it's between the same image, and we need to connect to the database for each request. And as our application grows bigger, maybe there's thousands of features, but if we want to test all the different combinations of features together, our test suite is going to become quite big. So what we do instead is create a layer of integration tests below it, where there's more integration tests than functional tests, where we test the different interactions. And then below that, we have a layer of unit tests, where there's even more of, which tests a very small piece of code. And as you might have noticed, I created a unit test suite, so we're starting with that. And from the previous video, I know that this environment class is quite simple. So let's start with a test case for this. So we create a new environment test class. And this is the wrong namespace. And that's because we missed the autoload def space here, or ESR mapping. Going to test folder, 2 backslashes here. And then here our namespace is going to be example tests. And test case class. And if we look at the class we're testing here, there's only one method we can actually test, because this constructor has a parameter which is also a property, but it's private, so we can't test that the constructor sets that. We can only test what the variable is used for with the get method. So let's add a function for test get. And as you can see, there's 2 buttons here. One to run all the tests in a class, and one to run the specific test. And we can actually also run an entire folder. But for that, we need to configure PHPStorm, because right now it doesn't know how to run it. So we need to go to the CLI interpreter and add the Docker Compose configuration here. So we apply, and then we go to our test frameworks, and we need to also add it as a remote interpreter here. And this should be our vendor autoload.php. And our configuration file is also in our .html. It's called phpunit.xml.dist. We click apply and OK. We now run our test case. It's gonna fail, but that's because we didn't check anything in this test. And let's collapse this for now and actually write the test. And let's first start with the scenario where the environment is completely empty. So we pass an empty array here, and we do an assert null on environment get to choose an environment key. And now we have our first assertion. Yeah, and we configured, or the default configuration in the current version of PHPUnit is to always require covers metadata. So we need to also add that as an attribute here. Covers class and environment. And we have our first test and assertion that's passing. And right now we only tested the fallback. So if the variable key doesn't exist, and we also need to add a test for when it does. So we can copy this over and actually pass it here. So we're gonna do an environment key database user value is user. And then instead of assert null, we want to do an assertSame. Should be. That's also passing. And it's good to also tell you something about assertSame versus assertEquals, because assertSame checks that the type is the same as well as the value, and assertEquals just checks if the value is the same after typecasting. So we want to make sure that this is also strict, so we use assertSame as much as possible. Now we can run these tests locally, but we want to make sure that these tests run after every change we do and that they alert us if anything is broken after a change. So let's close all of this. And let's actually add a GitHub action. Now, if you remember from last time, we set up a quality workflow, which does a composer validate, a check namespace, and runs on pushes and also on pull requests. And we can also manually run it. And right now it's passing, as you can see from the green check mark here. And we can base our new job on the composer validate job because it's doing quite a lot of the same steps. It's doing a checkout, then a setup, and then we need to do some other things here. But let's first make sure the name here is unique. Also give a proper name here. And instead of the validate, we do an install because we need our dependencies, especially PHPUnit. And then afterwards, we need to call PHPUnit. And we could do a vendor bin PHPUnit with a test suite here, but it's easier to also add a script section here. So next time we want to call the unit test, we have a shorthand call for that. So it's called unit, and then we call vendor unit test suite unit, and make sure that this actually works. It does. And then here we call composer unit. And let's actually commit this. Push the code. And then if we could go to our repository, pipeline is now running, or it's waiting to be picked up, but at least it exists. As you can see, our test cases have passed and our pipeline is green. That's it for today. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.